You're standing in a gilded chamber where the air tastes of perfumed oils and fear. A young girl sits motionless as skilled hands paint her face with ceremonial precision kohl around her eyes, crimson on her lips, scents massaged into skin until she gleams like polished bronze. She's 12 years old. Her mother works in silence, each brushstroke deliberate, transforming childhood into something else entirely. When the makeup is finished, the mother steps back, memorizes her daughter's face, and speaks words that will echo through centuries. Tonight, your father will summon you. You will go to his chambers. You will do whatever he requires. The girl nods, not yet understanding that some horrors are too systematic to be called crimes their institutions. And in the palace of the most powerful man on earth, this ritual has been perfected into routine. Before we go any deeper, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching. From it genuinely amazes me that a story this dark from ancient Persia can reach every corner of the globe today. The year was 519 BCE, and this was Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to India. The girl's name was Art, daughter of Xerxes I, king of kings, ruler of the Achaemenid Persian Empire and self-proclaimed descendant of Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity. In Persian royal theology, this wasn't poetic language, it was literal doctrine. Kings carried divine essence in their blood, making their desires sacred commandments no mortal could question. If the king wanted something, the wanting itself made it righteous. This wasn't just autocracy, it was theological certainty weaponized into absolute control. Art had watched her older sisters disappear from the women's quarters at a certain age, returning hours or days later with something shattered behind their eyes. She'd seen the pattern repeat with mechanical regularity, but she'd believed naively, desperately, that being his daughter meant protection. That some line existed even absolute power wouldn't cross. What she didn't know, sitting in that chamber as servants adorned her like a sacrifice, was that she was entering a system so corrupt it would shock even Persia's enemies when fragments of truth eventually leaked beyond palace walls. The infrastructure of her exploitation had been refined across generations. Palace eunuchs knew exactly how Xerxes preferred his daughters prepared. Court physicians had protocols for treating injuries discreetly. Mothers had learned which euphemisms might prepare their children for inevitable trauma. And Zoroastrian priests had crafted elaborate theological arguments explaining why royal blood must remain pure, meaning concentrated, contained, claimed by the king himself before being deployed for political advantage. Xerxes hadn't invented this system entirely. His father Darius had occasionally engaged in similar practices, though more sporadically, with more pretense of discretion. But Xerxes inherited not just an empire, he inherited its moral architecture, and he expanded it. What had been occasional became routine. What had been whispered became institutionalized. He took the raw power his ancestors had built and applied it to the bodies of his own children with the same systematic efficiency he applied to military campaigns. Understanding why requires understanding the man. Born in 518 BCE, Xerxes was the son of Darius the Great and Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Conqueror royal blood, flowing from both lineages, which gave him legitimacy but not automatic succession. Persian kingship wasn't simply inherited. It had to be seized, proven through divine favor and ruthless elimination of rivals. When Darius died in 486 BCE, Xerxes had older half-brothers with legitimate claims. He outmaneuvered them through a combination of his mother's political genius and his own willingness to make rivals disappear through mysterious accidents and sudden illnesses that court physicians couldn't quite explain. By 484 BCE, he was undisputed king of kings, but with one shadow darkening his reign, his father's humiliating defeat at Marathon in 490 BCE. If Persian kings were divinely ordained, how had Greek mortals beaten them? Xerxes became obsessed with answering that question through overwhelming military force, but he was equally obsessed with demonstrating absolute control at home. The ideology supporting his actions was already embedded in Persian culture. Fathers held extreme authority over children, especially daughters, who were viewed primarily as assets for political alliances and reproduction. But Xerxes pushed this framework beyond recognition. He didn't just arrange marriages. He claimed his daughters' bodies before deciding how to deploy them strategically, and the religious establishment provided justification. If royal blood was divine, keeping it concentrated meant extreme measures. Brothers married sisters, fathers could claim daughters, all to prevent dilution of sacred essence. Except this theological complexity was really just sophisticated cover for something simpler and darker. Xerxes claimed his daughters because he could, and because asserting control over his own family sent an unmistakable message throughout the empire. Nothing and no one existed beyond his reach. The system functioned through careful ritual. When a daughter reached puberty, palace eunuchs castrated men who managed the royal harem and her preparation. They knew the king's preferences with uncomfortable precision. Bathing until skin gleamed, specific oils that pleased his senses, clothing that revealed more than it covered, styled to make young girls appear older than their years, jewelry chosen to emphasize emerging curves, cosmetics applied to enlarge eyes, darken lips, create the illusion of eager maturity. Every detail calculated not for the girl's comfort, but for the king's pleasure. The psychological preparation was equally brutal. Daughters were coached on proper behavior, trained to simulate enthusiasm instead of fear. Taught to express gratitude for royal attention, they were reminded relentlessly that their bodies existed to serve the king. That resistance was impossible. That refusal would bring consequences not only for themselves, but for their mothers and siblings still trapped in the same system. Some mothers tried to prepare their daughters with careful euphemisms and survival strategies. Others remained silent, either hoping ignorance might somehow protect their children, or simply because words failed when trying to explain the inexplicable. Princess Xerxes was 13 when her first summons came. She'd spent the previous year watching servants prepare her older sister Roxana for these encounters, understanding without anyone explicitly stating it that the same fate awaited her. The night the eunuch delivered her summons, she felt her body go cold despite the warm Persian evening. The preparation took hours: ritual bathing, application of oils and cosmetics, selection of garments that left little covered. Other women in the harem, her mother included, participated in this process with faces carefully blank, hiding whatever they felt behind masks of compliance. When Xerxes was finally led through torchlit corridors to her father's private chambers, her hands were shaking so violently the jewelry on her wrists chimed like warning bells. What happened behind those closed doors is documented only through fragments testimony from court officials, diplomatic correspondence, references in Greek accounts written by historians who interviewed Persian defectors decades later. But the pattern is clear. Xerxes treated his daughters as concubines, ignoring their age, their family connection, their capacity to consent or understand what was happening. The encounters left them traumatized, and the trauma was compounded by one devastating reality. This wasn't a single violation. It was an initiation into ongoing exploitation. Some daughters were summoned regularly, rotating through the king's schedule of available women. They'd receive notice from palace eunuchs and have hours to prepare for another encounter, never knowing when the next summons might come, never safe even in the women's quarters that were supposed to be sanctuary. Others were called only occasionally, depending on the king's whims and which daughters currently interested him. The unpredictability created its own psychological torture. Did I anger him? Did I fall from favor? Is uncertainty better than regularity, preventing any closure or adaptation? The most devastating aspect was how completely it shattered the father-daughter bond. These girls couldn't seek comfort from their father because the man who should have been their protector had become their primary threat. To survive, many developed extreme coping mechanisms. Some dissociated completely during encounters, mentally abandoning their bodies and retreating into private inner worlds. They'd fix their eyes on specific points on walls, recite prayers silently, or construct elaborate fantasy scenarios in their minds, anything to escape the present moment. Princess Mandane, summoned repeatedly between ages 14 and 17, developed the ability to separate so thoroughly from her physical self that she appeared almost catatonic during abuse, staring through her father as though he didn't exist. Other daughters survived by surrendering completely to the system, convincing themselves that enthusiastic compliance might reduce suffering or earn small privileges. They studied their father obsessively, learning every preference, every presentation style that seemed to satisfy him, hoping that performing perfectly might make future encounters less brutal. A few attempted to maintain dignity through reframing, telling themselves their suffering was duty, that enduring this served the greater empire, that their sacrifice supported political stability. This mental gymnastics gave them fragile purpose, but required refusing to acknowledge what was actually happening. And some daughters simply broke. They became catatonic, refusing food, refusing speech, staring at nothing for hours. Palace physicians were summoned, but they had no framework for understanding psychological trauma. Their treatments, bloodletting, herbal remedies, prayers to Ahura Mazda, addressed none of the actual devastation. When daughters collapsed mentally, they created a problem for Xerxes. A non-functioning princess suggested the king's divine authority wasn't absolute. These broken daughters were quietly removed from the palace and sent to remote estates, kept hidden so they wouldn't embarrass the royal family or raise uncomfortable questions. What's most chilling is how normalized this became throughout the court. Palace officials developed scheduling systems for the king's access to his daughters, balancing his desires with practical concerns like recovery time between encounters. Eunuchs became experts at reading the king's moods and selecting which daughter would most likely satisfy him on any given night. Medical staff learned to treat injuries and trauma discreetly, avoiding documentation that might create records of abuse. They became complicit through their professional competence, managing consequences without ever questioning the system producing them. Even religious authorities were corrupted. Zoroastrian priests constructed elaborate theological justifications, arguing that royal blood was so sacred that concentrating it through the king's access to his daughters was spiritually mandated. They twisted doctrines of purity into proof that what seemed like abuse was actually sacred duty. This shows how completely power can co-opt even moral institutions when everyone's survival depends on royal favor. The broader Persian nobility also benefited, which ensured their silence. When Xerxes eventually married off his daughters to forge political alliances, nobles gained enormous social and political leverage. These princesses weren't being rescued, They were being transferred from one form of exploitation to another. The nobles knew exactly what they were receiving: young women who were psychologically damaged, struggling with intimacy and trust, often unable to form healthy relationships. But marrying a king's daughter, even a traumatized one, offered status and political connection that outweighed any personal complications. Then came Xerxes' massive invasion of Greece in 480 BCE, and the system evolved into something even darker. The campaign wasn't just military spectacle, it became another arena for weaponizing his daughters. Xerxes brought several of them along, officially claiming he needed familiar comforts to maintain royal dignity and project confidence in Persian victory. The logistics alone were staggering: special wagons with reinforced walls and heavy curtains to maintain Persian seclusion customs, teams of eunuchs managing every detail of their care, a baggage train that stretched for miles. The investment demonstrated how critical Xerxes considered their role in his campaign strategy. What Greek historians later learned from Persian prisoners and defectors shocked even cultures accustomed to slavery and concubinage. Xerxes wasn't just bringing his daughters for personal exploitation, he was using them as rewards for battlefield success. Commanders who distinguished themselves earned temporary access to royal princesses as bonuses for their achievements. These weren't formal marriages or concubine arrangements, they were loans of royal flesh, treated like military supplies, distributed to maintain fighting effectiveness. General Artabanus, who engineered the bridge across the Hellespont, received Princess Roxana for an entire week as reward for his achievement. Roxana was 17, already abused since age 13, now handed to a grizzled commander old enough to be her grandfather and expected to perform enthusiasm, to treat violation as honor. Commander Mardonius earned Princess Otosa for suppressing a rebellion among Greek allies before Thermopylae. Otosa, 19, had developed severe anxiety symptoms: trembling hands, shallow breathing whenever summoned for royal service, and now faced days with a stranger who viewed her as a prize he'd earned through military competence. The message to the army was unmistakable: perform exceptionally, and even the most forbidden pleasures might be yours. Ordinary soldiers, hearing that outstanding service could earn access to royal daughters, fought with desperate intensity. Officers competed ruthlessly for royal attention. Understanding that battlefield skill alone might not be enough, they needed to demonstrate absolute loyalty and willingness to serve the king's interests without moral limits. The surviving princesses returned to Persia carrying compounded trauma. They had learned their suffering could always escalate, that new forms of exploitation could be invented whenever the king desired. Princess Mandane, assigned to 4 different commanders during the campaign, developed complete inability to trust anyone, flinching violently even when female servants approached. Her psychological state became so fragile she required constant supervision to prevent self-harm. When the Greek invasion failed, naval disaster at Salamis, land defeat at Plataxerxes faced a legitimacy crisis. He'd claimed divine favor, yet inferior Greek forces had beaten his armies. His response was to tighten control over what he could still dominate. His daughters, the abuse that had been partially hidden under military necessity, now intensified. Xerxes summoned his daughters with increasing frequency, as though their submission could compensate for his battlefield failures. Young women who'd hoped the ordeal might end with the king's return instead found it escalating. Eventually, when daughters had served their purpose as victims, they were deployed in political marriages designed to exploit their brokenness for strategic advantage. Princess Art, 19, and scarred by 7 years of systematic abuse, was married to General Artabanus, commander of the royal bodyguard and one of Xerxes' most trusted officials. Refusing would have insulted royal dignity. Accepting meant binding himself irreversibly to the royal family through shared secrets that made betrayal unthinkable. Art entered marriage already psychologically destroyed, carrying trauma that would shape every relationship for the rest of her life. The daughters who survived bore children who inherited their mother's psychological damage. They raised families and households marked by instability, mistrust, and fractured intimacy. The dysfunction Xerxes created didn't remain contained within his immediate family, it rippled through Persian aristocracy for generations, producing a ruling class that was internally weak and psychologically compromised. This internal corruption contributed to the empire's eventual vulnerability when Alexander the Great invaded decades later. A civilization that had normalized such exploitation at its core was already collapsing from within. The records that survived are fragmentary, carefully coded entries from court officials protecting themselves while documenting what they witnessed. Letters from Greek observers struggling to describe practices that defied their comprehension. Testimony from Persian defectors who escaped the court and spoke cautiously to foreign historians. But the fragments align, they tell a consistent story of systematic abuse justified by religion, enabled by institutions, and normalized by everyone whose survival depended on royal favor. Years after Xerxes' death, one of his surviving daughter's historians believe it was a masterpiece, though records are unclear commissioned, a private memorial in a remote estate. It was a small garden with a reflecting pool, surrounded by flowering trees that bloomed briefly each spring before scattering petals across still water. No inscription explained its purpose, but according to testimony recorded by a Greek merchant who visited the estate decades later, elderly servants said the garden was for the daughters who disappeared, those who broke completely under the weight of their father's attention and were sent away to die quietly in isolation, their existence erased from official records. The pool reflected sky and branches. The blossoms fell and floated and eventually sank. And somewhere in that image beauty framing absence, nature continuing while memory fades, lives the only monument those daughters ever received. Not their names, not their stories. Just the recognition that something unspeakable had happened, and someone, finally, had refused to look away.